Good afternoon. My name is Marilyn Heyer, and I'm a co-founder with Paula Pace of L.I.N.K, linking Indigenous and Non-Indigenous Knowledge. So welcome. It's wonderful to see you all here today, and a big welcome to Sherri Mitchell. Deep gratitude for traveling to the Cape. Thank you. And sharing your clarity with us in this very chaotic time. We believe that Sherri Mitchell's perspective on the interconnectedness of all life and our responsibility to care for this precious earth and its inhabitants is absolutely central to our survival. She brings a compassionate heart and a profound understanding. Thank you. How about now? Oh, I can hear it too. Okay, I see the difference. We believe that Sherri's perspective on the interconnectedness of all life and our responsibility to care for this precious earth and its inhabitants is absolutely central to our survival. She brings a compassionate heart and a profound understanding of the need for healing divisions emerging from a history of genocide, the past and present erasure of Indigenous peoples and their cultures, a history we all carry within us. Her book, Sacred Instructions, has been a guiding light for L.I.N.K. We studied it in our study group, read it in our community book group. For those who don't know us, we are an educational, not-for-profit group whose mission is to raise awareness in our Cape Cod communities of the culture and true history the Wampanoag people have endured. We hold the space for Wampanoag and other Indigenous voices to tell their stories, and we seek ways to heal ourselves and our community. I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge two people, Rachel Hicks and Kathy Paspa. They are our L.I.N.K event planners whose passion and commitment to fulfill our mission has, as many of you know because you've attended our educational series last year, it's quite wonderful. That series was in conjunction with Wampanoag educators, and we actually wouldn't even be here today gathering if it wasn't for their efforts. So much gratitude and love for who you are and what you've done, Kathy and Rachel. And also thank you all for coming. So we'll begin, as we always do, with the L.I.N.K land acknowledgement. And then I'll pass the mic to Andrew Maffey, who's one of the planners for our community book group, and he'll say a few words and introduce Sherri Mitchell. The L.I.N.K land acknowledgement. As inheritors of the first harm, the stolen land, we acknowledge that we on Cape Cod are living on the ancestral, unceded, and occupied land of the Wampanoag Nation. For over 12,000 years, land was never owned, never possessed. The people and the land were and are one. We seek ways to heal and repair our relationship with the Wampanoag people and the earth through accountable actions that raise awareness and address the taking of the land, institutionalized racism, and the generational trauma caused by settler colonialism. We honor the Wampanoag's resilience and ongoing perseverance to be seen and acknowledged for who they truly are. We're grateful for their knowledge and wisdom that value living in balance with all life and protecting our earth for future generations. Andrew?
So this microphone does sound a little bit off. Maybe we can just make sure that it's okay. Are people hearing all right? It's good? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming here to hear Sherri this afternoon. I'm more honored than I think any of you would know to introduce Sherri. First, some logistics. Please turn off your cell phones so that we're not interrupted. And there are restrooms outside, but if you go to the left, they're locked. So you need to go out and go to the right and head down the hallway quite a bit to get to a restroom. L.I.N.K wants, okay, those are logistics. L.I.N.K wants to thank the Fund for Science for their generous support, allowing L.I.N.K to provide the 2025 Connections to the Land program, of which this talk is the first event. As many of you know, we had a series last year where we had a speaker every month in 2024. We won't have them every month this year, but this is the first of that. Please check in with our website at linkcapecod.org for more information or to sign up at the L.I.N.K table outside in the lobby to receive our emails. And donations to L.I.N.K can be made through the website, and there's also a donation jar outside. And we're grateful for any donations we can get. So, the L.I.N.K Community Book Group meets on the fourth Monday of each month. Since September of 2023, we have been meeting together to educate ourselves about both local Wampanoag history and the worldview that they hold. And we've also explored generally about other wider Indigenous worldviews by reading books, listening to podcasts, and watching videos from various Indigenous authors. Please send email to info@linkcapecod.org if you would like to join the community book group. So my respect for Sherri's work blossomed when I saw her talk back in 2018 in Maine talking about her book, Sacred Instructions. In March, April, and May of 2024, the L.I.N.K Community Book Group read and discussed her book, and this experience had a huge impact on me, personally. I've got other words here, but I think I just need to speak from where I am, just to say that first of all, there was the wisdom that was just pervasive through this book, again and again and again, chapter after chapter. And then there was creating this framework which allowed me to allow the events of the past, the present, and the future to be placed, to have a completely different view of what was happening, right? And in these days, that's so important to me, right? That here I sometimes feel so overwhelmed that having this fresh view, this different worldview, was so key. But then, as I was volunteering for L.I.N.K, there's this understanding that came, which is that it isn't enough just to read about a worldview in order to make it part of you. There's experiencing, and there's a deeper dive that's necessary because you need to put aside that one worldview and then just enter this other one and become that. So, that's a taste of the effect that the book has had. And listening to her audiobook, by the way, is amazing. Okay, so Sherri. Sherri Mitchell, Wenahamu Quasit, is an Indigenous attorney, activist, and author from the Penobscot Nation. She received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Arizona, specializing in Indigenous peoples' law and policy. She's an alumna of the American Indian Ambassador Program and the Udall Native American Congressional Internship Program. In addition to her award-winning book, Sacred Instructions, she is also a contributor to more than a dozen anthologies. Sherri is the founding director of the Land Peace Foundation. It's an Indigenous educational organization that focuses on Indigenous leadership, environmental justice, and land matriation, and kinship building. The Land Peace Foundation has provided training for some of the largest environmental NGOs on the planet, helping them to develop better policies and procedures for engaging with Indigenous peoples living on the front lines of climate change. She serves as a trustee for the American Indian Institute. She sits on both the Global Indigenous Advisory Council and the North American Advisory Council for Nia Taro's Indigenous Land Guardianship Program, and she's a board member of the Post-Carbon Institute. Sherri's also the recipient of several human rights awards, and her portrait is featured in the esteemed portrait series, Americans Who Tell the Truth. She is the convener of the global healing ceremony, Healing the Wounds of Turtle Island, a gathering that has brought more than 50,000 people together from 6 continents, with elders from 40 Indigenous nations, to focus on healing our relationships with one another and with our relatives in the natural world. So without further ado, Sherri Mitchell.
My goodness, I'm surprised I could climb up over those stairs. I just felt so inflated here. Jeez. I said to Tim, I said, I think they're going to have expectations. I would like to first acknowledge Elder Ramona Peters and Chief Earl Mills, who are in the audience, and just graciously ask your consent to be allowed to speak in your territory. Oh, Julian. So those of you who know me, which may be few of you, I almost never read from a script. I do much better when I am not reading from a script. But I had some things that I had already written down related to this topic. So what I propose in our time together is that we have 2 events. We have this event talking about the rights and connections of our relatives in the living world. And then we have a free-for-all where we just talk about anything. Any questions that you have arising during this time, whatever's most alive for you in this moment, anything you want to ask me from the book, I'm open to all that. I believe that the magic happens in the Q&A when we're really in dialogue with one another, eye to eye, heart to heart, and breath to breath. And so I want to have that time with you while I'm here. I drove all this way. It'd be a shame to have me just read a speech off of a paper. And so how does that sound? Are we in agreement that that sounds like a good way to go? Okay. First of all, I just want to say, Kwe Pasidawin, hello everyone. Andalawisi wanahamugwasit, Najio Banawabskewi, Andilna Bamakawasus, no Banawabskewi, Nagakakagus Niltibayik. My name in my language is Wanahamugwasit. Fairly well done, Andrew. And I am Bear Clan from the Penobscot Nation and Crow Clan from the Passamaquoddy tribe at Zibayik. And I have one rogue grandmother who was disowned by her people for marrying a native who was from the Isle of Skye in Scotland. And so my daughter, when she was little, used to tell people that we were Penobscotch. And so she's still pretty witty about coining a phrase, something that we appreciate in our household. So when I introduce myself in my language, it helps to orient me in place. It puts me in context with the lands, waters, and peoples where I come from. It helps me to remember who and what and where I am. Banawabskewi, Nagapaskadamakadi. One of my favorite quotes comes from a Crow elder named Shees Crow, who once said, "The soil you see beneath your feet is not ordinary soil. It is the dust of the blood, the flesh, and the bones of our ancestors. You have to dig deep down through the surface before you can find nature's earth, as the upper portion of the soil is crow. The land as it is my blood and my dead. It is consecrated. Here in Mashpee, the land as it is comprised of the beloved dead of our relatives, the Wampanoag. It is holy ground, sacred because it carries within it all the beings who have come from and to this land, human and non-human alike. The presence of these ancestors within the land imbues it with meaning and reminds all those who walk upon it of the deep connection the people have to this place. To honor the long-held connection to these ancestors, I would like to ask all those who are able to stand with me for a moment to recognize the presence of those ancestors here in this land. Thank you very much. Connection to place is a primary orienting point for Indigenous peoples. We are spatially oriented, rooted in the lands that we come from. I'd like to take a moment to explain to you what that means to me. Orientation to the land is one of the primary differences in orientation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, specifically related to perceptions of time and space. For many cultures in the Western world, their orientation is connected to time. They see themselves moving across time, being moved by time across various spaces. Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, often see themselves rooted in a specific or particular place, with time moving around them. We are spatially rooted in our homelands, connected to all time and all those who have lived within that space or place. This is why our connection to our past and future generations is ever present, because time does not move away from us in a linear track. Instead, it circles around us, enveloping us in its embrace. We hold places as sacred not because of their location or even proximity to us, but because we recognize the capacity of those lands or waters to hold the essence of the events that have taken place upon them, that are held in time. These beliefs and associated worldviews are central to the care that Indigenous peoples have taken in the guardianship of their lands. In the last 6 centuries, there has been a significant disruption in Indigenous connection to place. In fact, the forced separation of the people from the land is the very core of colonization. This severance of Indigenous peoples from their lands runs parallel to an acceleration in the destruction of the ecological health of Niguskiktimik, Mother Earth. Much of it caused by the extraction of resources, timber, minerals, fossil fuels, and the expansion of industrial agriculture. The destructive methodologies used in these practices is the direct result of seeing the world as a fragmented collection of resources to be exploited, rather than as a living relative to be cared for. By now, most of us have heard the staggering statistics related to Indigenous lands and their correspondence to ecological health. What we know is that about 1/3 of the Earth is still under the guardianship of Indigenous peoples. And on that 1/3, there is about 80% of the global biodiversity, 40% of the healthy ecosystems, and about 1/3 of the above-ground carbon. It is not a coincidence that the lands that remain under Indigenous guardianship are the healthiest on the planet. This is the direct result of a reciprocal relationship with the land. where we take care of the land not through a domination, ideology, or some arrogant assumption of stewardship, but by taking responsibility for balancing our own relationship with all aspects of life within our territories. In return, the land takes care of us. As Skidginawak peoples, we view the world around us through a lens of kinship, viewing the living beings that we share our environments with as distinct families or clans that we must learn to live with in respectful and balanced relationship. My dear friend Mi'kmaq, whose husband is Wampanoag, Gizitanemuk, is a wisdom keeper from the Mi'kmaq Nation at Escanobitich. And she once told me this story of a dream that she had about her tribe's relationship with the whales. In the dream, she was standing on the shore with her grandfather. As they were standing there, a whale came up, came near to the shore, raised its fin, and held it out. On the fin were 3 wampum shells, which our tribes have historically used for trade. She recalled looking at those shells and then being amazed when her grandfather reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 very similar looking shells. The whale then spoke to them and reminded them that their first treaty had been with the whales, and that her people had agreed to live in right relationship with the beings in the waters surrounding their homelands when they first arrived in that place. Most Indigenous peoples have similar stories about sacred agreements, what we call Lagutawagan, with the animals, plants, lands, and waters. Another friend of mine, Dr. Kyle Powys-White, a Potawatomi scholar, wrote, "Having a treaty relationship with an animal community involves knowledge of the ecological interdependence of humans and animals. Involvement can be in the form of human ceremonies, harvesting, and caretaking practices that, at different times of the year, protect critical habitats. It involves recognizing that at other times of the year, there are very few, if any, interactions with these animals, and humans should stay away. There are even highly instructive stories of animals working together to address the fact that humans were breaching treaty obligations. Our story of the first illness is one of those stories. Treaties with animals motivate humans to act reciprocally, responsibly, and respectfully. Such behaviors are energized annually through ceremonies, educational institutions, mentorship traditions. Empirically, maintaining treaties involves constant learning about how to maintain relationships of interdependence that support clean, safe, and healthy environments for all. An understanding of our interrelatedness with the rest of the living world is beginning to grow. This knowledge was once held by all peoples, long before the impacts of global warfare, feudalism, and colonization began to rip people from the land. Our goal now is to reconnect with that knowledge, to allow our species the privilege of continuing to evolve our consciousness on Mother Earth. I think one of the challenges, going off script here for a moment, one of the challenges that we have right now is eliminating the illusion of separation that we have. Even those among us who understand interdependence don't understand interrelatedness. They have a theoretical knowledge, but they don't really understand that the 1 million species that are currently at risk of elimination and extinction contains humans among them. And so, go help that woman. Please. Thank you. So going back on script, many climate change adaptation models, because there are climate change adaptation and mitigation models that are being imposed upon Indigenous populations that are being forcibly removed from their lands as a result of climate change and other environmental and ecological destruction. And many of those adaptation models contain proposals that involve moving indigenous peoples away from their traditional ways of being toward commerce, and severing their direct relationship from the land. Of course, this is a mistake. Rather than moving indigenous peoples further away from their connection to the land, perhaps it is time for Western leaders to truly listen to indigenous voices and realize that the solutions to the many ecological and climate-related crises that we are facing will not be found in technology developed in a lab. It won't be supported by some new green economic strategy, nor will it emerge from a policy developed by some governmental agency. It will only be found in a new way of being that is balanced and connected, the way of life that has been actively demonstrated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Most indigenous knowledge systems comprise values that inform our decision-making day by day. Our day-to-day activities and long-term strategies all involve a deep sense of groundedness that is found in our way of life. For us as Banawabskewi people and Paskatamakati people, that is Gijinawe Bamasawagan. It's a sacred way of being in relationship with the rest of life. The indigenous governments and institutions that employ traditional values as a central operating system are the same ones that have conserved and or sustainably utilized the gifts of their lands for millennia. The challenge for environmental thinkers today, even those within indigenous communities, is to see beyond the confines and inherent biases that are present in the Western scientific lens and in economic models that propose unending growth, to a new way of seeing that provides a picture of the holistic patterns that are present within each of our ecosystems and the whole of the created world. Seeing through an indigenized lens requires one to recognize the relationships, both subtle and overt, that exist between and among all things, and to then acknowledge the many ways that all these systems are constantly moving toward harmony and balance. Unfortunately, a great deal of critical indigenous knowledge has been sidelined by the carefully controlled gatekeepers of Western institutions, which has made its holistic concepts difficult to comprehend, especially for those who have been taught to see the world in fragmented, commodifiable pieces. It is this fragmented worldview that has caused the deep fractures in our world that are now leading to the threat of extinction for over 1 million species. This year at COP16, one key agenda item was the adoption of the monitoring structure of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which includes monitoring of traditional knowledge and key indicators on land use changes and land tenure, the practice of traditional occupation of land, and the linguistic diversity that connects to how we live upon the land. Our traditional languages teach us how to be in right relationship with the world around us. They are both instructive and relational, and they are never objectifying. Understanding how indigenous language helps maintain relationships to the land is critical to the preservation of the land. The word for sovereignty in our language is Ndabalamosultipin, which means I own myself. Indigenous languages recognize the inherent right that the land has to exist as it is on its own terms. In this respect, it is this respect that has always been at the center of our kinship with the land for millennia. In the Global Biodiversity Framework monitoring system, there are also provisions for the full and equitable participation of indigenous peoples in biodiversity decision-making and on other matters affecting our lands, knowledge systems, and interests. All of this is being guided by indigenous peoples from around the world. 3 of my colleagues have been involved in this process very deeply. My organization, the Land Peace Foundation, is also doing its small part in our homelands. we have reclaimed a 215-acre parcel of land that was taken from Indigenous hands and given away in a land grant the year that Maine became a state in 1820. In 2020, almost 200 years to the day from when it was taken, we bought it back. When we first brought the land under our umbrella, we thought long and hard about what our relationship with the land was going to look like. We then crafted specific language around this relationship and added it to our bylaws. I'd like to share this with you. The Land Peace Foundation honors the sovereignty of the land, which means we acknowledge the right that the land has to exist, free from molestation and the expectation of human productivity. The reclamation of land by the Land Peace Foundation is viewed as a ceremonial homecoming, a transitional process that moves the land back to its rightful status as a co-equal being, possessing the same rights that we expect for ourselves. It is our intent that the land find sanctuary under the umbrella of our organization. Therefore, the officers and employees of the Land Peace Foundation shall view the land as a living relative, honoring the rights that the land holds when making alterations to or on the land. The Land Peace Foundation further commits to choosing minimally invasive and sustainable practices when working with the land. As an organization and as a collective of human beings, the Land Peace Foundation also honors the right of the land to remain intact. Parcels may be added, but no lands shall be marketed or sold. They may only be transferred into the care of an organization with aligned values and commitments toward honoring, healing, and protecting the land. That's part of our organizational charter, and we hold to that. We sat with the land for a full year before we did anything. We brought in wildlife biologists and learned who our relatives and our neighbors were who were living there with us. We learned about the mating seasons of the migratory birds that nested in our meadows and around our barn. And when we renovated the barn into an educational space, we put up alternative housing for all of the barn swallows who came there to have hatchings every year. And so we tried from the outset to be a good relative and to pay attention to what the land needed. Today we are working to make this land a living example that helps others learn how they can rematriate the land, not just by returning the land to the people and addressing what we have lost, but also in returning to the land what it lost in the process of being taken, primarily its sovereignty, and vital nutrients, biodiversity, and its right to exist and thrive on its own terms. Like so many Indigenous land-based organizations, we are operating on some basic principles that help guide our action. They are both ancient and emergent, meaning that they have stood the test of time and are now finding new methods of expression. I'm sure you're all aware of them, but humor me for a moment and let me go over them with you. The first one is responsibility. This is responsibility toward our territory, toward our thoughts, our ideas, and our actions toward the land and all of its inhabitants. This sense of responsibility cannot afford to be, as Andrew said, theoretical. It must be demonstrated through our actions and ways of being. Then comes respect. Respect for all living beings, and demonstrated respect for one another, something that is sadly missing from our societies at the moment, is a deep and abiding respect for one another. There needs to be a demonstrated respect offered to Indigenous peoples' ways of life, ways of knowing, decision-making, and methodologies. The concept of Indian time is something that was explained to me by my grandfather. I always, had known about Indian time, and I once made the grave mistake of referring to my lateness for an appointment with one of my professors as I was operating on Indian time. My grandfather's a founder of the Wabanaki Studies program and Native Studies programs. He was a forerunner for Native Studies programs across the country, Ted Mitchell. And he invited me to have a seat. And so I sat there ready for it, braced. And he said, that was a violation of one of our sacred teachings, that was blasphemy, if you will, that I was using something that our people had coined to acknowledge giving things the time that they take in order to do them right, or allowing ourselves the time to make a fully informed, good decision as an excuse for disrespecting the time of others. And that stayed with me, because that's a colonization of our own ways of being. Like when we start to unravel and look at the ways that we have normalized, colonized thinking within our own ideology, we realize that the depth of our work is immense. The amount of things that we have to continue to unravel within our own thinking as we're moving through this process. And the ways that respect is given are countless in the ways that we engage with one another and acknowledge one another. Today, many decision makers are overburdened and rushed, and in the pressure to work within the confines of those pressures, there lives a deception that is robbing countless species on this planet the right to continued existence, the right to be considered meaningfully. We have to slow down and begin making decisions that are right for the entire living world, not just human economies. The third one is relationship. Basilda and Dilnabamuk, for us, we recognize our relationship with our ancestral lands and all of the elements that make up and sustain life. We have to eradicate all ways of being that are based on the exertion of power over another or the living world, and consciously work to bring ourselves and our lives into balance with the rest of life. Number 4 is reciprocity, not as a transactional exchange, not a this for that philosophy, but an understanding that reciprocal sharing is an essential part of a natural life cycle. Reciprocal sharing and reciprocity are subtly different, but importantly different. Reciprocity is oftentimes viewed as, if I give you this, then you reciprocate by giving me that. Reciprocal sharing is living a circular way of life where you recognize that as you're growing up, you're oftentimes being raised by your aunties and your grandparents. And then when you come to the place where you're strongest in your life, it's you're responsible to take care of them in their old age. And then, they're also taking care of the young ones and guiding them. And that we're taking care of each other at different stages of our lives, giving each other the best of what we have, taking in some places, giving back in others. That we're constantly moving. And one of the things that we have stopped doing as human beings is giving back the very essence of our life to Niguskiktimik at the end of our lives. We pump ourselves full of chemicals, we put ourselves in little wooden boxes, we put those wooden boxes in cement boxes in the ground, and the essence of our life is never returned to the earth. We are not reciprocating in the ways that we were meant to reciprocate with the living earth. All of the things about that are representative, are in balance with the rest of life. Number 5. For those of you who are really paying attention, we're on number 5. Reparations, taking steps to actively heal damaged or severed relationships with other people and with the land. This is really important. Reparations is not about financial gain, it's about the repair of relationships. There is a sacred aspect of that. One of my friends wrote a book called Reparations as Spiritual Practice. And he's currently teaching that as a course at Harvard. And then there's redistribution, a rebalancing of the sources of our survival. This could look like a redistribution of the lands that were taken from Indigenous hands, being transferred back into Indigenous care as a form of reparation. It could look like helping rebuild loving and caring and nurturing relationships with the Black farmers who were charged with pulling profit out of this land for colonial masters whose lives had been robbed from them, and who have trauma related to their relationship with the land, helping to heal that trauma, reconnect those people who had been so violently taken from their homelands and made to work these lands here in really horrific, degrading, dehumanizing ways, not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of others who are misusing them. Those types of reparations are essential. That healing of those foundational relationships is really core to our healing as a species, to restoring our sense of humanity. We can't restore our sense of humanity if we're ignoring the gaping wound that exists at the center of our nation, which was built on the premises of genocide and slavery. And so if we really want to be able to move forward and look at where we are, we have to look at how we got here and what are the things that need to be healed and corrected within our own thinking so that we can cycle forward more evolved, more connected, and in more loving relationship with one another. And then the last thing is rematriation as an antidote to colonization. Some folks like to think about rematriation as only being about women's work. And it is connected to the life givers. It's definitely connected to the essence of the mothering spirit of Mother Earth. It's about returning to kinship. It's about the reconnection to life, family, kinship. And so where colonization is representative of a severing of a people's connection to the land, rematriation is an active practice of healing and reconnecting to the earth. For us as L.I.N.K, we are matrilineal, matricultural, matrifocal peoples. And so that rematriation is a returning to the essence of that mother care at the center of our ways of being, our ways of knowing, and our ways of maintaining relationships with one another. So as we move forward from here, representing our respective nations, families, organizations, groups, institutions, individual positions, we must look together toward our shared future. We must now strive to remain mindful of the critical need for collective action and collaboration to address the climate crises and other global emergencies in ways that honor the sacredness that is present in every living being, including the living earth herself. Despite the known challenges that we face, I remain hopeful. My hope is not a naive hope based on magical thinking. It is a realistic hope that is rooted in experiential knowledge, the knowledge of all those who have come before us and faced very hard times. We carry within us the wisdom of those ancestors who have moved through dark times and survived. Their survival gives me the hope that I need to face the challenges of this day. I call this ancestral hope. So to close this portion of our program today, I would like to offer you this wish, that you may all find within yourself your own pathway to ancestral hope, and that it may guide you to courageously take the actions that are most needed during these very challenging times for yourself, your loved ones, and all those who have yet to be born. If we listen very, very carefully, we can hear them beckoning to us, asking us to pay attention where we place our feet upon the earth so that they have a place that they can walk upon when they enter into this world. So, Basilda and Dilnabamuk, I offer these words for all my relations. Kachiwaliwan, thank you so much for listening, and I hope this is just the beginning, the primer for a good conversation that we can have with one another. So, thank you. Phew, okay, we got through that. Now let's have a chat.
Thank you,
Ask a
Sherri.
question. Don't be shy.
Raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone. Anybody who has questions, just raise your hand nice and high. Kathy, somebody over here in the front row.
Oh. Hi, thank you for being here and for all of your work. I've heard you speak about this rematriation process, about inviting men back to their hearts, and I was wondering if you could speak some to that. I'm hesitant to just say, how do we do that? But yeah.
Okay, let me see if I understood you correctly. About inviting man or men back to their hearts? Men. So let me give a little bit of context, because I take it you have heard me in conversation before. One of the things that we do at Wajukam Dultina Kinship Community, which is the land-based campus where the Land Peace Foundation lives, Wajukam Dultina means let's help one another. We have an annual men's healing gathering there. This year we had men from the United States, Canada, and from Aotearoa who came to participate. It had 50 men up on the back lawn behind our barn learning a new haka. It was very nice to see them connected with something that brought an essence of something forward that connected them also to the land, and learned how the gift of their life came through the body of a woman. That's what this haka was teaching them, this reverence for the sacredness of their own lives. And so we have this ceremony that we host every year that I bring in men who I have deep respect for and incredible trust for to guide this process. And they do the work that is needed on the land there. And why we have that gathering is because of something that happened to me in ceremony about 25 years ago. So I was in Montana, and the ceremonial people in the room are going to really appreciate this. And so we would be in ceremony for weeks at a time as the teachings and prophecies were being brought out. And we were in the Pryor Mountains. No, we were in Big Sky on this particular occasion. So we were out in the mountains, and it was late July, early August, and it snowed on us. And the people who held the land that let us have the ceremony there, because it was in a protected area, wouldn't let us light individual fires. And so we were very cold. And I didn't want to get out of my sleeping bag and go to sunrise ceremony. And so the drums started coming through the camp before the sun was up, telling everybody it's time to get up and come to the arbor for sunrise ceremony. And I was moaning the whole time, going, oh man, because there's Indigenous people there from all over the Americas. And our relatives, the Haudenosaunee, have a Thanksgiving prayer that can last anywhere from 3 hours to 3 days. That's not an exaggeration. 3 weeks if you've got a minute, to give them. And so I was laying there in my tent, getting ready to get up for, I was actually in a teepee. They put us in teepees. You could tell it was a non-Indigenous group who let us use the land because they put up a bunch of teepees and wouldn't let us have fires in them. I'm going to out myself here. I was laying there and I was praying, please, please don't let it be the Haudenosaunee. Please let it be some little tiny Pueblo guy who hates the cold, who's going to be real quick so we can go back to bed. And so we get out there and we get in the arbor, and I have my blanket wrapped around me, and I was sitting there trying to get over myself, and the gentleman who was leading the sunrise ceremony said, all of you women can go back to bed. We're going to do a men's pipe ceremony here this morning. And I was like, yes. And so I got up and I started to walk out of the arbor, and right before I got to the doorway to walk out of that arbor, I was just told, you to sit down and start praying for these men. And so I sat down and I was like, jeez, somebody help these pitiful men, you know, keeping me out of bed this morning. And, you know, over time, my prayers softened, and I was sitting there, and all of a sudden in front of me, I could see a light, and I thought, oh, you know, because I had my eyes closed, the sun is coming up, good. And then I remembered I was in the west, and I was facing west, and I was like, well, that's not the sun. And then there was another one, and then there was another one, and I just got curious about it. And eventually there were 12 lights that I could see around this circle. It's perfectly round lights. Looked like the full moon. And so I just kept praying for these men, for the healing of their hearts and their minds, and praying for us that we would know what to do in order to heal the relationships that existed between the masculine and the feminine, and all the spaces in between. And I got a really clear message that the women were never going to be able to stand up in their full strength unless we helped do the work of giving the men back their hearts, because their hearts had been taken from them through the advent of colonization. My partner, Tim, here, his family, one side of his family comes from Sicily, and there was actually an edict in Sicily that said that it was forbidden by the church for there to be any public grieving when someone had passed, because it would deny God's heavenly reward if you showed any grief over the loss of somebody that you loved. And so there was this shutting down of the heart that was involved in that. And there were many other examples of that across time that we've all been subjected to. And the feminine aspects that we all carry are receptivity, intuition, heart-based knowing, an ability to take that heart-centered wisdom and divine intuitive knowing and walk it out into the world with the masculine energy. That first part is critical to being able to birth logical, balanced, healthy, nurturing, loving realities in the physical world. And so when the men are robbed of their feminine aspects, they lose connection to their heart-based wisdom. They lose connection to their intuitive knowing. They lose their ability to be able to walk things out into the physical world that are balanced and whole and healthy. And if we don't help them to reconnect to that heart-based wisdom and intuitive knowing, if we cast them out with systems of patriarchy, which is an imbalanced representation of masculinity, we're going to see things like we've seen in the last election, which is all of the young men who are being told that their time is over, that they don't have a place in society, going to the extreme right in defense of their masculinity, because there's nobody showing them what a healthy, balanced, masculine representation looks like in the society, and making space for them to inhabit that space, guiding them, nurturing them, loving them into wholeness. This is our responsibility as members of the society. This is our responsibility as mothers and grandmothers and aunties, sisters. In our language, the word for grandfather is musamo, and the word for heart is misun. Please come in and sit down. We're not formal here, we're all friends. Come on in and sit down and get comfortable. It's okay. You don't have to stand in the doorway. And so there's an understanding that as you go through life, your masculinity becomes balanced with healthy femininity. that masculine and feminine live in a balanced relationship within you. The name for grandfather is a representation of that. It's a recognition of onboarding the heart of the mother into the masculine in the representation of the grandfather, who is able to lovingly care for their grandchildren in ways that they often weren't able to lovingly care for their own children as fathers. It's a softening and an opening that allows for heart-based wisdom and divine intuitive knowing to emerge from within them in full expression in the outside world. That's been blocked. And that's not the fault of those who were never taught. You know, many of us were never taught how to be emotionally intelligent. And yet when we fail to be able to manage and utilize those skills, we condemn ourselves. We judge ourselves. We feel like we're lacking for not having skills that no one taught us to have. So how do we make space and allow grace to enter into the equation so that we all have the opportunity to learn together through love and nurturing and kindness how to be whole, healthy, and balanced human beings? I mean, this is the critical challenge of this moment. It's not the repetition of cycles of condemnation where those guys over there are to blame and they're pointing right back at us. And I just wrote a piece about that says, and then rightfully, eventually, every one of us is to blame. Because our condemnation and self-righteousness toward any other is not walking them back to wholeness. It's further dividing us. It's creating more division. It's increasing levels of violence within our society. And so how do we put our hand out to offer people a reconnection to their heart space? How do we look somebody in the eye and see a relative who has perhaps lost their way? I wrote about that in Sacred Instructions, and lovingly walk them back home. We don't do that through condemnation, through judgment, through assigning and projecting onto them broken systems and imbalanced ways of being that we have adopted. Instead, we allow for course correction in ourselves, and we give space for course correction within them. It's a very challenging thing to do, especially when so many people are at risk of harm. It's one of the greatest challenges that we've faced as a species on a global scale. So how do we do that? I don't have all the answers to those questions, but I know that it lies within the wisdom of our own hearts, that it will be guided by intuitive knowing if we take the time and sit and listen to the quiet knowing of our own wise and beautiful hearts. And if we respond to people in a way that has some compassionate awareness for how they ended up where they are. It's much easier to not do that and to condemn and to criticize and to cast out. And that's an impulse that's natural. But it's also something that we need to evolve beyond, that we need to allow ourselves to say, this is our instinct, but who do we want to become? I think that this is another thing that I've been writing a lot about in the new book is understanding that we are doing many things. People are talking about we're birthing the new, we're hospicing the old, and we're trying to imagine into being new ways of being in relationship with one another that none of us have ever experienced before. This is completely new terrain that we're navigating on a global scale. There are things that we can reach back for in our history, some of these values that I talked about, these ways of knowing, ways of seeing one another, but some of this is all new territory, which is why it becomes critically important to use Indigenous knowledge at this time. Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall used to talk about two-eyed seeing, seeing through both an indigenized and a Western scientific lens, so that you get a picture of how the two come together. My friend Terrell Fern, who is a brilliant Mi'kmaq matriarchal scholar, has taken that concept even further, from Etawumptamig, two-eyed seeing, to Metawumptamig, which is all system seeing, whole system seeing, looking at it through a rematriated whole systems lens from a traditional perspective that takes into account all of the beings who are engaged in that seeing, not just human beings from two different populations, but from a holistic perspective that includes all of the animals, plants, and trees, the waters and the winds, all of those systems that are coming together. We need to be able to have that same willingness to come together as a species, despite the things that we see that make us different. And that right now, I think, is our work. And so not only are we giving hearts back to one segment of the population, we have to give ourselves back to the deepest, most pure aspects of our own hearts. And that's a very challenging thing to do. It's not easy, and I'm not going to claim that it's easy, but it's necessary at this time. This is the place of evolution that we have arrived at collectively. And now we have the opportunity to make different choices than we've made in the past, to move forward collectively without eviscerating one another. That was a long answer to your question. Thanks. Don't get me going. I drove a long way. I got things to say. Another question?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presence and wisdom and warmth. I have this dream or vision that somehow that we could share stories of interrelationship from diverse perspectives in our systems.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I have this dream that we could share stories from various perspectives within systems to convey interrelationship in a way that people can digest and inspire people. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of stories where there's benefit happening in interrelationship that could be shared with a wider audience to support healing in our world.
I have all kinds of ideas. I think that my ideas are one idea of many. I'm sure that you have ideas. The theme of all of our gatherings this year, last year we looked at, over the last couple years, we've looked at the stories we carry and the stories that carry us, looking at how the stories that we've been brought up with and that we've been held within influence our view of who we are, to the degree that we have not been able to determine who we are on our own terms. And I think that this is something that a lot of Indigenous peoples have been subject to because of the ways that, especially here in this country, legal recognition of Indigenous populations are tied to colonial understandings. So that's done two things. It's prevented a lot of expansion and evolution within Indigenous communities, because if we don't look like this, then we're no longer Indigenous. And you know, there were a couple of groups that were represented in the history books. So if you weren't Navajo, Lakota, Haudenosaunee, then you clearly weren't Indian, right? And so it's had a restrictive impact on the stories being told by Indigenous populations. It's also created a predatory opening for those pretending to be Native, who can just model themselves after these narrow parameters and perpetuate stereotypical depictions of who we are as Indigenous peoples. And so you have this dichotomy going on of these, repressive and then opening spaces for Indigenous identity. And I think that this is true for many peoples, that there have been historical colonial ideas that have shaped and defined who we believe we are, whether it's as Indigenous peoples, as Christian peoples, Jewish peoples, white peoples, male peoples, female peoples, transgender peoples, straight peoples, gay peoples, that leave us pigeonholed in distinct camps that prevent all of us from becoming whole human beings. And so when we have a greater understanding of the impact of story in that confinement and realize that we're actually the narrators of our own stories, that we are co-creating the realities that we are living in. There's an environmentalist named Frances Moore LePay that I've spoken with at a couple of different environmental events over the years, and one of the questions that she asked the first time I met her is, why are we collectively co-creating a reality that none of us would individually choose to live within? And in that is the key to understanding that we have the power to collectively co-create the reality that we're living in. But that requires us to take responsibility for those narratives. It requires us to take responsibility for stories such as, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, whatever that rhyme is, that all school children are taught. It's a total bullshit story that has no basis in fact. But it's a story that we have used to define our society to the point where conquest has been viewed as reverent and heroic and admirable. So how do we then, theme for this year, write ourselves into our own mythology? How do we begin recreating narratives that allow for us to actively co-create worlds and realities that we as individuals would want to live in? How do we collectively come together? This is what I want you all to do. This is your homework. Nobody's going to check to see if you've done your homework, so it's up to you to decide if you want to do this. Bring groups of people together, whether it's a handful of people or 100 people, and collectively begin to flesh out an image, not of what you hate. We're adept at defining and drawing the water that we're drowning in. How do we begin to define and to draw and to describe the world that we most want to live in? How do we begin to hold that image up collectively, breathe life into it, in order to allow for that world to begin to emerge as flesh and blood? A hint is that in the process of that imagining, we have to think, who are we in that world? How do we talk to one another? How do we take care of one another? How do we see one another? And then we have to become people who are capable of living in the world that we most want to inhabit as we imagine it to be. And when we begin to become those people today, that world begins to walk out in flesh and blood much more quickly. So when we're thinking about the importance of story and our role as storytellers of the current and future realities, it comes back again to responsibility. Do we have a responsibility to hold a vision for a future that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren can walk into, that allows for them to live a life of some dignity? Do we have a responsibility to hold an image of a world unmolested and unburdened by human expectations of profitability and productivity that we then balance our lives in relationship to, rather than trying to bend the natural world to us. As the storytellers, what stories are we going to tell? I think that's what we all need to be asking ourselves today. And how do we disentangle ourselves from the stories that have thus far been told about us and about the ways that we're supposed to be, so that we can have the freedom to move toward something new? One of the things I just wrote, a line that I just wrote in the new book last week, was one of the greatest challenges we have with our current systems is our level of entanglement with it. You know, with them. We are so deeply entangled with these ideas that have been espoused by people hundreds of years ago that have disallowed us to evolve in consciousness and in relationship with one another in meaningful ways, that we have allowed these systems that harm the many to benefit the few to proliferate within our societies in ways that are causing not only discomfort, but real, legitimate destruction and harm of living beings across the living world. And we have allowed for a normalization of our own helplessness in that story. How do we then begin to write a story that reclaims our own power and the ability that each one of us has to contribute to the creation of a world that is more loving and kind and just and equitable and humane and sustainable? We all have to decide what that is for ourselves, because it's different for everybody. And that's how we flesh out a whole society, is by everybody coming at it from their own perspective and bringing themselves to the process of building a whole world based on basic principles of kindness and love and care. And so when we talk about story, it again comes back to that sense of responsibility, reciprocal sharing, redistribution of the essences of life to all living beings. Those values still hold sway at the center of all that we do, even the way that we tell stories. Do we want to leave ourselves isolated to a moment in history, or do we want to continue to become thriving, evolving, meaningfully engaged individuals with the reality of this moment and the building of something new?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have no idea what time it is, so somebody's going to have to keep an eye on time, because I will just stay here until Tim is like, I'm really hungry.
You've been answering this for the last hour, but
Oh, hold your hand up so I can see you. Where are you?
Here.
Okay, hi.
I really appreciate how you ended the book in prophetic time, and for the last hour you've been enveloping us in prophetic time. But my question centers around, how do you deal...
Can you put the mic just a little bit closer?
How do you deal with the cannibalistic, Wetiko, Wendigo, however you want to phrase it, when it's right in your face? You've been explaining this for the last hour, but is there obviously further elaboration when these forces of evil or the devil is right there?
Yeah. I think this is an important question, and this calls for us to do a deep examination of ourselves. And so at the heart of most of those stories, Wetiko, Wendigo, Giwok within our tradition, the cannibal giant, is an aspect of protectionism at the core. And so Giwok, the cannibal giant, wakes up to the cries of the Earth Mother in order to protect her from those who are consuming faster than she can produce and harming her faster than she can heal. So they dance the people into this hypnotic dance, and the Earth begins to spin faster and faster. You can Google this. The Earth is now beginning to spin faster, and scientists have not been able to explain why that is, until they spin themselves off the planet so that Mother Earth can restore and heal herself. Our traditional stories say that this is the 4th time we've been here, that our species has been seeded here on this planet to try to get this right, so that we can learn and evolve and grow together and come to understand the power that we have as co-creative beings. So when we look at the story themselves, and we study those stories, and we look deeply into those stories, what we see is that there is a protective element there that has been neglected by the people. There is a protective element at the core. Somebody has been hurt very badly. They've been wounded very badly. Their family was killed or starved to death or ostracized or in some way harmed, and it turned them into this monster. Always at the core of those stories is an aspect of deep love and protectionism that has gone awry, that has become distorted. And so if we think about the ways that we are currently living within a distortion ourselves, if we want to look at what we're viewing as pure evil, we have to be willing to sit with that story until we understand what is the fear-based protective aspect that exists at the core of that story. And how can we speak to that need? Because I think that there are very few people on the planet who are purely evil. I think that true evil does exist, but I think that there are very few people who at their heart are purely evil. I think there are people who have felt cast aside. I think there are people who have felt oppressed and suppressed and left out. I think there are people who have been shamed and ridiculed and judged, and that those people have come together in different populations and pitted themselves against some perceived other who has harmed them. We can't come together and address the harms that are being caused by all of those factionated groups without looking at the core of harm that's at the center and trying our best to understand the heart, the love, the protectionism that exists there. How do you get a character who is authoritarian, narcissistic, only thinks about themselves, has such a huge ego that all other living beings be damned in the pathway to getting some type of ego stroking, some type of recognition as being great in some way? You get people like that who have been horribly abused and neglected by those who are charged with their care. That's so of the current folks who are in positions of authoritarianism and oligarchs, how is it that you say that one? Technocrats, that there is a lack of connection with a maternal element oftentimes in their life. Lack of connection with a loving, nurturing, caregiving adult. There is a breach so that they have an anxious, insecure attachment style. They have developed personality disorders and psychological disorders that are a distortion of the purity of their being. What I do in these situations, because we talk about it and we struggle with it, because we are both people of deep faith within our own traditions, Tim from his tradition and me from my own ceremonial tradition, where we understand that there is a beauty and a purity that exists within the spirit of those who are doing harm that has been deeply distorted and constricted and twisted by the realities that they have come here and lived within. And so how do we begin to address that? I think we have to pause. I think we have to really be willing to consider from a really deep perspective, how have we as a society contributed to the creation of the manipulations that have happened? And then I think we need to step in the flow of harm that those distortions are causing and prevent them from coming at the people that we love. So we have to do this exploration of what is wrong. I talk about that in the book as an 80-10-10 rule. We have to look around us. We have to see what's wrong, what's broken, what's distorted. We have to be willing to really try to understand that from a deeper perspective. This is the part where we're required to evolve our consciousness, to not do what's easy, but to engage in what is hard and right, or correct. We'll use that word instead of right, because it's become such an inflammatory word in our current societies. We'll avoid directional language today. It's not an easy question to answer because there is real harm being imposed on people who are very vulnerable, who are in need of our protection. And so, investing 10% of our time looking around at the harm coming, another 10% of our time blocking the flow of harm towards those who are being targeted, and then 80% of our time actively imagining and building the world that we most want to inhabit. One of the things that I think is important as we're thinking about how do we unify, we don't unify homogenally. We cannot unify as a homogeneous blob. We unify like ecosystems. Each of us honoring and respecting the diversity within our populations, the value that each position holds. Each group holds a specific position of balance that they can bring to the equation. Invasive species are the result of imbalances within the ecosystem. So that happens when we try to homogenize, when we do monocrop agriculture. It's no different in our human species than it is in our biological species. We have to be able to move forward unified in our diversity. So we can't say everybody has to be like me and then we all move forward because we're all in agreement. We have to be able to mature spiritually and emotionally to allow for, to accept, to embrace difference, and disallow harm. That requires us to show up as critical thinkers, creative problem solvers, and heart-forward beings. That's not easy. I acknowledge that it's not easy, but that doesn't mean that it's not the correct way to go about it, right? We get the kit from IKEA, and some people sit down and they carefully look at all of the directions. They look at all of the pieces. They try to understand how all those pieces come together, and then they very thoughtfully put the thing together according to the instructions. And then there are those who throw the instructions out and they just throw it together and they have all kinds of leftover parts. The people who are going to be replacing that piece of furniture very soon are the ones who carelessly throw away all of the parts and just throw it together in a way that makes sense to them, because it's easier to do it that way. It's easier for us to throw away all the pieces that don't make sense to us. It's easier for us to just throw something together that matches our ideas of how it should be. It's much harder to have to carefully consider and thoughtfully engage with the process of building something with multiple parts, some of which we don't understand the purpose of, over time. And the rapidity with which we are trying to make decisions, rather than slowing down and thoughtfully engaging, is part of the problem that we have to solve. So if we can't slow ourselves down, take meaningful, thoughtful, well-considered, loving and caring action in the face of this rapid onslaught, we're sunk. Because we're going to make mistakes. That doesn't mean that we stop the flow of harm that's coming towards us, because we absolutely must. But behind that wall of protection, we need our best and brightest minds, our most open hearts, thinking about how we do this in a way that carries us all forward together, rather than fragmenting us into separate pieces. So we could talk about that for a week, but we'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
We have 25 minutes left. Right here? Yes.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. You started to answer the question I had in my head with your response just now, but on our peninsula, which is of course very environmentally fragile and also very socially fragile, I see in the public conversation a love of the land pitted against the people who live here. For example, there is a constant tension between the availability of fresh water and the ability to build affordable housing. And there's, from people who love the land, there's often a lot of fear and a lot of like this mindset of scarcity that there isn't enough to go around. And I'm always looking for nuance and better ways to talk about how we can take care of our people and take care of our planet at the same time. And I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, you might not love to hear my thoughts. It's a strong possibility that here's a fact, right? We have a finite amount of water on the planet, and we have a finite amount of fresh water that is rapidly being destroyed. So fresh water is the front line of survival for the planet. We also have millions of empty buildings that already exist on the planet. And so if we want to solve a housing problem, we don't need to threaten a freshwater source in order to do that. We don't need to build new. What we need to do is we need to repurpose empty buildings. We need to become creative about the resources that already exist out there and how they can be retrofitted to fit the needs of the people. Because we have amplified ourselves as a species, having the arrogance of calling this time the Anthropocene, to the point of delusion. There's no better way to say it. That we have imposed our importance on the rest of the world, and it's time for us to step that back. If that means that some people have to live in a place where they don't necessarily want to live in order for the planet to survive, then that's what that means. And right now, putting the needs of the planet that is in deep distress, that is the only thing that ensures our survival into the future so that we can create more humane and just systems, has to be prioritized. And so there's no balance between the environment and the needs of the environment and the needs of the people. The needs of the people have been centered for far too long. It is now time for the needs of the environment to be centered and prioritized. Thanks. Any other questions?
Hi, just as a quick follow-up.
This conversation was being had in the Affordable Housing Committee at one point, and I said at the time, we do not have a problem between clean water and affordable housing. We have a problem between affordable housing and McMansions.
Yeah.
The wrong use of land.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have to be willing to challenge the status quo, and realizing that, you know, this notion of an American dream is entry into a nightmare, and that illusion that is created by unending growth and expansion of having a living space that is large enough for 100 people to be being utilized by 1 or 2 people is a crime against humanity, but more importantly, it's a crime against the planet. And if we don't start taking those things seriously and creating boundaries, like we've learned, right? All of the self-help stuff teaches us that we heal ourselves by creating healthy boundaries. How many of you have thought about creating healthy boundaries in your life? Come on, be honest. Every single one of you, if you're a thinking and feeling person, has thought about, I need to create a safe, healthy boundary in order for me to remain intact. Since people have forgotten how to speak the language of the animals and the plants and the trees and the soils and the winds and the waters, we have to be willing to look at what does a healthy boundary look like for human beings. How can we impose healthy boundaries upon human beings? How can we impose healthy boundaries on building? How can we impose healthy boundaries on wealth? How do we impose healthy boundaries on this notion of unending growth without consequence? We have to be able to do that, which means we have to mature spiritually and emotionally and take responsibility for the impact that we have on life. And if we're not willing to do that, we're not going to make it. I mean, plain and simple. The planet has capacity. The planet will continue to exist and heal itself long after it flicks us off for not being able to find our pathway to living in balance with the rest of life. This is about our survival into the future. The requirement for us to survive into the future is for us to learn how to live in balance with the rest of life. Life will go on without us. Whether we are allowed to continue that journey with the rest of life is up to us. Thanks.
So the question that I have for you, and thank you for being here tonight, or this afternoon, is that you speak and you show us a mother-loving spirit, but you also are trained in the Western legal system. Mm-hmm. And my question, and to me, that Western legal system almost always has winners and losers, and it is very, so I might say, Western masculine. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, how have you blended the two, and what do you find the most difficult in that experience of your life where you've brought these two very disparate outlooks on our world? Thank you.
Thank you. So let's think about this together from a different perspective. Many of you have probably heard that the imposition of colonial legal frameworks have been imposed upon Indigenous peoples. Have any of you heard about that? And so if we hope to be able to address the harms that are being imposed upon us as Indigenous peoples by a legal framework that was designed to eliminate us, we have to have a deep understanding of that. And so that's my point of entry into that world, is how do we understand and negotiate and avoid the pitfalls and the trappings of these systems that are trying to destroy our sacred way of life and our existence altogether. And so it's not a very hard thing to understand. I don't actively practice law. I do have one small legal contract that I maintain with my own tribe, and it is a contract with my tribe's social services department, and only involves cases that have our children involved in them, our tribal children involved in them. And I only do that because I want to remember why I do the things that I do, and it's for the future of our peoples and for the continuity of our cultural ways of being into the future. And so all the rest of the work that I do is educational and protective of the earth. So, yeah, I'm not living in any conflict.
Thank you. 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. A follow-up question on that is because so much of the harm that's embedded in the society is the legal system. How do you see we migrating out of that, no matter how well we do all of the heart work?
So the title of the new book is Rise Wild. And I quote Tim in this book because one of the things that we've talked about is the importance of having, protecting, preserving the wild living earth. If we look at the projection of what's on the screen right now, what we see are those who are seeking a post-human world. People who are in positions of authority, who have grasped at power for the purpose of immortalizing themselves. And this involves some folks who have an intention of moving us to a post-human world where we're actually uploading our consciousness into machines. So the destruction of the earth in the process of that movement is unconcerning and part of the agenda. And so when we think about the ease with which we are controlled by technological machines, the ways that our attention has been diverted through technology, the ways that we are manipulated through technology, it's really critically important to recognize the need to have a wild, living world that is not governed by technology, because we are far more easily controlled when we are in technologically controlled groups than we are if we're not connected to those groups and we're living as distinct beings who are part of a larger living ecosystem. It's much harder to control wild living earth than it is people who are completely dependent upon technological industrial systems. So we move away from that by extracting ourselves to the greatest degree possible in our lifetimes from those systems. We start learning how to feed ourselves and our neighbors again. We start moving away from large-scale industrial power grids. We start claiming our sovereignty over all of the essential aspects of our lives, because the trick has been, and this is another thing that I'm writing about in the new book, I can't wait for it to come out so we can talk more about it. But, so, you know, of course, my publisher would say, these are all copyrighted ideas. And would probably get in trouble for talking about them in advance, but I'm always a fan of trouble. So,
We won't tell anybody.
don't tell anybody, yeah. So, Mashpee TV, don't tell anybody. One of the other things is this illusion of movement, this illusion of change that we've been operating under. All of our movement history involves incorporating excluded groups into the status quo system. It has involved giving people a place at the status quo table. It has not involved an exit from those systems. And so the more we have this illusion of change where people are being added to the system as progress, the more entangled we become with those systems, the more hard it is for us to extricate our systems, the more people who are subjected to harm if we want to take those systems down. It's a trap. And if we want to be able to move beyond that trap, I think what we need to do is figure out how we can begin to actively, day by day, disentangle ourselves from dependency upon those systems. Yeah.
Sherri, I want to just say, I thank you for that conversation you just had, because I was really thinking, I've been at odds for some time with my computer. Just, I have a real issue with the fact that if I want to renew my driver's license, I have to go on a computer to do it. If I want to make an appointment, I have to go on a computer to do it. I'm not very computer literate. I mean, I can get by, but I have tried to stay out of it. I try to stay away from it. But, how do I fit in this world that I'm living in right now without being techie?
So here's the thing. Here's the rub. This is what I think. Just a girl from the res. You can take it or leave it, right? Here's what I think. You having a driver's license is not going to determine whether you live or die, necessarily. You being able to feed yourself and have access to clean drinking water is going to be a big determinant of that. You accessing things that give you privileged benefits within the operating systems that you're moving in that are not connected to life or death, engage them or don't engage them at your will, right? I have a driver's license. We're oftentimes annoyed that we can't renew our driver's license online because we live in such a small town that we have to actually go into the office and renew our registration for our vehicles and stuff. And so, think about what is necessary for people to survive. Build up those systems. Community, food, water, some type of energy source that allows people to be warm, especially here in the Northeast. Do everything you can to eliminate the likelihood of, or to reverse, the privatization of the things that are essential to your survival. That's the clear pathway, because then if the systems come down, people are still going to be able to survive. They're still going to be able to feed themselves, have access to clean drinking water. They're still going to be able to have a community of care that includes doctors and nurses and people who know how to do things that are critical to our movement forward. If we have systems in place that allow for us to pick up the pieces and carry each other forward, we'll be okay. We need time to figure these kinds of things out.
Thanks for coming.
If we have marketed out wholesale all of the elements of our survival, all of the sources of our survival are in the hands of others. We are easily controlled. If we know that we can make it without them, they lose their grasp on us. So this entanglement has to be a choice. You have to decide the degree to which you are willing to be entangled and whether that entanglement involves necessary aspects of your survival into the future. And if it does, how do you extricate yourself and build systems and put systems in place within your region? Because we're going to need this across the globe. How do you create systems? We're amping up our food production this year so that we can help feed as many people as possible, so that we can do what we can do to help support the survival of and the well-being of all of those that we have the opportunity to help within our capacity, within our territory. You know, there are other things that we're doing to help people to heal their hearts and minds, to build community, learning ways that we can connect people from disparate groups around different and difficult conversations. You know, there's a whole array of things that we have the capacity to do that we are bringing our best selves to the process of doing. And so, you know, it really is about choice and awareness. You can choose to have a driver's license. You can choose to, you know, do all of these other things that require you to participate in the system in an online basis, or you can choose not to have those things. What you can't choose is whether or not you're able to live without access to water, because the human body is not capable. You can't choose whether or not you have the capacity to live without food. Despite the, you know, I'm going to live on mana movement, the human body does not have the capacity to live without food beyond a certain point. Can I evolve into a whole human being with my sense of belonging and connection and dignity intact if I don't have a loving community that I'm a part of? Look at the things that are essential to your survival and to your existence as a whole human being, and make sure that those things are not controlled by those systems. And then choose where your levels of engagement are going to be beyond those things. I hope that's helpful.
I think that might be the last word.
I think we're out of time.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.